the candles had been lit for 3 hours when Eleanor Whitcomb was told, in front of 40 people, that she did not belong in the room. The great ballroom at Ravensmere House glittered like the inside of a jewel box, gold on white, the orchestra threading a country dance above the murmur of silk, and at the far end of it, a woman in violet turned to her companion and said, quite audibly, that someone had let the nursery downstairs. Eleanor stood very still against the pale wall, holding a small folded fan she did not open, and did not answer. She had learned long ago that answering cost more than silence. She was 26 years old, and she had come down only because Lady Sophronia, the child in her charge, had begged to see the dancing from the gallery and had fallen asleep against her shoulder before the second set. Now the child slept upstairs, and Eleanor lingered a moment too long at the edge of a world that had already decided what she was. Her gown was gray, clean, retrimmed twice at the cuff where the thread had worn thin. Around her, the room wore diamonds. She felt the difference the way one feels cold through a thin coat, not as an idea, but as a fact, against the skin. At the head of the room stood a man. No one approached without invitation. Julian Ashcombe, Marquess of Ravensmere, tall and dark and still as carved stone, watched the dancing without seeming to see it, one hand resting at the breast of his dark blue coat as though he had forgotten it there. He had not danced. He had not spoken above a dozen sentences all evening, and when the woman in violet made her remark about the nursery, Eleanor saw his head turn one slow degree toward the pale wall where she stood. She looked away first. What she did not yet know was that he had been looking at that wall for the better part of an hour, and that the grief he carried under his hand had a name, and that the name was not far from her own. If you have ever stood at the edge of a room you were not meant to enter, and felt the whole of it decide you were furniture, then stay with me, because this is a story about being seen. Now let me take you back to the morning it truly began. Eleanor had come to Ravensmere in the 3rd week of a wet October, hired by letter, met at the gate by a housekeeper, and no one else. Her father had been a clergyman in a small living in the north, a gentle, scholarly man who had loved his books and trusted the wrong parishioner with a loan, and when the debt turned sour, it had turned on him. The living was lost. The name was tarnished by association, unjustly, though injustice did not restore a name. He had died the winter after, quietly, in a rented room, and Eleanor had folded his coat, taken from it a single small button of mother-of-pearl that had come loose at the cuff, and gone out into the world to earn her bread as governess to whoever would have the daughter of a disgraced man. Ravensmere had taken her, because Ravensmere, the letter implied, did not care overmuch about the north. The child was the reason. Lady Sophronia was 7 years old, dark-eyed and watchful, and she did not speak. She had not spoken since the spring. The housekeeper told Eleanor in a low voice on that first evening, standing in the cold nursery with a single candle between them, since her mother died. The mother had been the Marquess's sister, widowed young, and she had come to Ravensmere to be cared for, and had instead sickened and gone, and the child had been left to a bachelor uncle who did not know what to do with silence in a small body. 3 governesses had come before Eleanor. 3 had left. The first had tried to coax the child into speech with sweets and small bribes and left, when the sweets were refused. The second had reported to the Marquess that the girl was slow and had been sent away within the fortnight for saying so. The third had simply given her notice and gone without explanation on a wet Tuesday, and no one in the household had blamed her. The child, they said, was impossible. The child, Eleanor thought, on that first night, watching Sophronia arrange 3 small pebbles on the nursery windowsill in a careful row, and then look at them as though they were the only ordered thing in a disordered world, was not impossible. The child was waiting for someone to be quiet with her instead of at her, so Eleanor was quiet. She did not demand speech. She learned the shape of the child's days and fitted herself to them, rather than the reverse. She discovered that Sophronia would eat if the food were set down without comment, and ignored, and would not eat if watched. She discovered that the child slept badly, and woke before dawn. And so Eleanor rose before dawn too, and lit the fire herself, rather than wait for the maid, and sat with a book in the gray first light while the girl watched the flames. She read aloud in the evenings whether the child listened or not, working steadily through a volume of old fairy tales she had found in the schoolroom, her voice level and unhurried, asking nothing. She left the pebbles where they lay. When Sophronia moved them, Eleanor moved with her and named nothing. And once, when the child arranged them into a small square instead of a row, Eleanor arranged 3 of her own beside them. And the girl looked at the 2 little patterns for a long time, and did not smile but did not look away either. And on the 9th morning, at the top of the stair, the child reached out without being asked, and took Eleanor's hand, her small fingers cold and certain, and held it all the way down. And Eleanor felt something in her chest that she had not felt since the north. A small warmth with a sharp edge, the feeling of being needed by someone who had chosen it. She had been in service long enough to know how rare a thing that was, and how dangerous to want. The house itself, she learned slowly. It was very grand and very cold, more monument than home. Its long gallery hung with ashcombe faces that all wore the same careful reserve, generation after generation of pale, composed people who had learned to give nothing away. The corridors were wide and echoing, and the fires were built small, as though warmth were an indulgence the house disapproved of. The Marquess she saw seldom. He rode out early before the household stirred, and returned late, and took his meals apart in a small dining room she never entered, and when their paths crossed in a corridor he inclined his head half an inch and passed, saying nothing, a tall silence in a dark blue coat. The servants spoke of him with respect and no affection. He paid well and fairly and remembered their names, and never raised his voice, and none of them would have said they knew him. He was just, they said, and distant, and he had not been the same since his sister died. He kept the door of the yellow sitting room, which had been hers, locked, and no maid was permitted to go in. The dust gathered behind that door undisturbed. Eleanor understood locked doors. She had learned in the north that grief keeps some rooms shut, and that the kindest thing a stranger can do is to walk past them without comment. She did not try the handle. It was the dowager who named her first. Lady Ravensmere, the Marquess's aunt, had come to keep house that season, and to see her nephew married before the title wanted an heir, and she moved through the rooms like weather, changing the temperature wherever she stood. She was a handsome woman of 60, with a straight back and a cold, clear eye, and she had spent a lifetime being right about who belonged where, and she was very seldom contradicted. She found Eleanor in the library one afternoon, returning a volume of history the child had wanted, and looked at her the way one looks at a chair set in the wrong place. "You are the new one," she said. She did not offer her own name. She did not consider it necessary. The governess. She let the word sit a moment, weighing it, turning it, the way she might weigh a coin she suspected was false. "See that the child is kept above stairs when we have company. My nephew has enough to trouble him without the whole county reminded of his sister's affairs. There's been talk enough. I will not have it renewed by the sight of that child at every window." She drew on her gloves, which she had not needed to remove, as a way of ending the conversation. "You understand me. You are here to be useful and not seen." Eleanor curtsied and said she understood. And she did understand, entirely. And the understanding was a stone she carried out of the room and set down beside all the others she had gathered since the north. She might have carried it in silence forever. The house was filling that autumn, guest by guest, because the dowager was assembling a season under Ravensmere's own roof, carriages arriving through the wet afternoons and trunks carried up the great stair, and among the guests came a young woman named Miss Arabella Croft, who was everything Eleanor was told to be grateful she was not. Miss Croft was 19 and golden and rich, the daughter of a family the dowager approved, with 3,000 a year of her own, and a laugh that carried pleasantly across a drawing-room. She had been arranged at the Marquess's dinner table, and in his morning room, and at his side on the terrace, with a precision that fooled no one and was meant to fool no one. She was the correct choice. Everyone said so. She said so herself, in 100 small, graceful ways. in the little proprietary comments she made about the house, the way she asked the housekeeper about the linen, as though the question were already hers to ask. She was not unkind, exactly. She was simply certain, the way people are certain who have never once in their lives been told they did not belong somewhere, and she looked at Eleanor when their paths crossed with a mild incuriosity. One gives a servant, carrying something heavy, seeing the gray gown and the worn cuff and nothing else, seeing, in fact, nothing at all. The first time the Marquess spoke a full sentence to Eleanor was over the child. Sophronia had slipped the nursery and been found in the long gallery at dusk, standing before the portrait of a fair young woman in a green gown, a woman with a child's own dark eyes and a mouth caught by the painter on the edge of a smile. Eleanor had found her there, and knelt beside her on the cold gallery floor and not pulled her away, and had looked up at the painted face and understood at once whose it was. That was where the Marquess found them both, coming quietly along the gallery. In the last of the light Eleanor rose quickly, an apology already forming on her lips. A governess caught where a governess should not be. But he was not looking at her. He was looking at the child, looking at the portrait, and something moved across his face and was disciplined back into stillness, the way a stone settles after it has been thrown into water. When he spoke, his voice was low and level. "She comes here," he said. "It was not a question most evenings," Eleanor answered. "I do not stop her. I think she is visiting." He was quiet for a long moment, and in the quiet, Eleanor watched him look at the painted face of his sister and watched the discipline it cost him to keep his own face still. Then he said, "You have not tried to make her speak." "No, the others tried. I know it is. Why they failed. I think she has been made to feel that her silence is a fault to be corrected. It is not a fault. It is where she is keeping herself safe until she is ready to come out. She had said too much. She knew it the moment the words were out." He looked at Eleanor, then really looked, for the first time, his dark eyes moving over her face as though he were reading something written there in a small hand. And she felt the look the way she had felt the cold at the ballroom wall, as a fact against the skin. "Do not stop her coming," he said. And then, after a pause, in a voice so low she almost missed it, "Thank you." And he turned and went down the gallery into the dark. And Eleanor stood with her heart going too quickly for a reason she refused to examine, in front of the portrait of a dead woman who had also, once, been someone's whole world. There is a particular loneliness in being seen by no one, and a sharper thing entirely in being seen by one person after years of the first. Eleanor did not have a word for what began that autumn, and would not have used it if she had. She only knew that she began, against her will, to know exactly where in a room he was. She would be reading to the child by the nursery fire, and hear a horse in the courtyard below, and know it was his before she looked. She would pass the study door and feel the awareness of him behind it, like heat from a hearth she was not permitted to sit at. Her body knew things her mind forbade, and her mind, schooled by the North, by the button in her pocket, by every closed door she had learned not to try, told her steadily and without mercy that a Marquess did not look at a governess and mean anything a governess could keep. The dowager watched her nephew the way a general watches a field. She saw before Eleanor did that his eye had begun to travel toward the nursery when he thought himself unobserved, and she moved to close the ground. She increased Miss Croft. She arranged more dinners, more terraces, more careful proximities, and she found small occasions to remind Eleanor of her place, always politely, always in passing. "The governess may take her supper upstairs tonight," she said one evening within Eleanor's hearing and Miss Croft's. "We are a large party, and the table is arranged." Miss Croft smiled into her glass. Eleanor took her supper upstairs and read to the child, and did not weep, because weeping was a luxury of people who could afford to be seen doing it. What the dowager did not know, what no one in the house knew, was what the Marquess had seen through a half-open door on a gray afternoon a fortnight before the ball. He had come up to the nursery floor. For some reason he did not examine and would not have admitted. Some pull that brought him more often than his business required to the passage outside the room where the child was, and he had stopped there because he heard a voice through the door left ajar. It was Eleanor reading, her voice going steadily along in the low, even way she had. But the child was not listening. The child was crying silently the way she did, without sound, her small shoulders shaking under the plain nursery pinafore, her face turned into the arm of the chair, and Eleanor had stopped reading. She had put the book down on the floor beside her, not marking her place, as though the place no longer mattered, and she had gone to the child and gathered her up against her without a word. She did not ask what was wrong. She did not tell the girl to hush, or to be brave, or that all would be well. She only held her, and rocked slowly, and pressed her cheek to the dark hair, and let the child cry into her shoulder for as long as the crying wanted to last. And the Marquess stood in the passage in his riding coat, with his gloves still in his hand, and watched a stranger, a hired stranger with worn cuffs, give his sister's child the one thing he had not known how to give, and had not given, in half a year of trying to be sufficient. He watched, and he did not go in, because he understood that going in would end it, and that this was a thing he had no part in, and no right to interrupt. He went back down the great stair very quietly. He stood a long while at the window of the locked yellow room, looking out at the wet grounds without seeing them, his hand at his breast where the grief lived. That night at dinner he said even less than usual, and did not once look at Miss Croft, who was seated at his right in rose-colored silk, and talked pleasantly to fill the silence, and did not notice that he was somewhere else entirely, in a passage on the nursery floor watching a woman rock a child. The wound he carried had a shape, and the shape was this. His sister Cassandra had written to him from her widowhood in the north, a series of letters that grew, month by month, quieter and more careful, asking whether she and the child might come to Ravensmere for a season, or longer if it suited. And he had delayed. He had not refused. Refusing would have been a decision, and he made no decision at all, which was worse. He had been busy with the estate and the parliamentary session, and a dispute over drainage rights with a neighboring landowner, and 100 things that had seemed at the time to matter. He had written back that of course she must come when the house was less occupied, when the session ended, when the weather turned. He had put off her coming by a month, and then another, and then a third. Each delay reasonable, each letter of hers a little thinner than the last. When at last she came, in the spring she was already ill, and the physicians said, with the useless honesty of physicians, that the illness had been long in her, that it had likely been working in her through the very winter he had left her in a cold rented house in the north, and that it might have been caught earlier, in a warmer house, with better care. With a brother who came when he was called. He had not caused her death. He knew that, in the part of his mind that reasoned. But he had spent every month since, certain that a better man, a quicker man, a man who put a grieving sister above a drainage dispute, would have had her under his roof in time. And that certainty did not answer to reason. He kept her last letters in a drawer of the desk and did not read them, and could not burn them. He had failed her while she lived by being too late, and the one thing left to him, the only amends the world still permitted, was that he must not now fail her child. That was the grief under his hand. That was the door he kept locked. He had decided, in the cold and tidy logic of a man determined to punish himself thoroughly, that he had no business being happy, that happiness was a thing he had forfeited the right to, somewhere on the road, between her first letter and her arrival. And he had arranged his whole reserved life around that sentence like a man building a wall around a garden he intends never to enter. And then a governess with worn cuffs had held the child in a nursery on a gray afternoon, and said nothing, and undone the whole careful arithmetic in the space of an afternoon, because she had done, without being asked and without hope of reward, the exact thing he had failed to do, and had shown him that the thing was not, after all, beyond doing. The dowager's escalation reached the child before it reached Eleanor, and that was her error. 10 days before the ball, she summoned Eleanor to the morning room and informed her, over her needlework, without looking up, that arrangements were being considered to send Lady Sophronia to a school in Bath. A good school, she said. Well, a well-regarded establishment where the child would be among her own kind, taught properly by a staff equipped for difficult cases, and off the hands of a household that would shortly have a wedding to arrange and a new mistress to settle. She said the word wedding lightly, as one lays down a card one is fairly sure will win. And she glanced up then to watch its effect. Eleanor's face did not move. She had spent years learning to keep her face from moving, and she kept it now, and curtsied, and said only that she would, of course, do whatever the family thought best for Lady Sophronia. The dowager returned to her needlework, satisfied, and Eleanor went out of the room with the stone of it in her chest. That evening she found Sophronia at the gallery portrait again, standing in the last light before her mother's painted face, and Eleanor knelt beside her on the cold floor and told the child, honestly because the child had been lied to and managed and spoken over her whole short life, and deserved at least one person who did not do it, that nothing was decided, that she would not go anywhere without Eleanor knowing, that Eleanor would not simply let her be taken. She did not know if she could keep the promise. She made it anyway. And Sophronia turned from the portrait and put both arms around Eleanor's neck, and held on with the whole strength of a small body that had lost too much already, her face pressed into Eleanor's shoulder, and Eleanor felt the child's heart going quick and frightened against her own. And Eleanor, kneeling there in the dark gallery holding her, made a decision she had no right to make and no power to enforce. She decided the child would not be sent away if there was anything in her, anything at all that could prevent it, and that she would risk her place and her reference and her bread to prevent it, because there are some things worth more than a place, and a frightened child holding onto your neck is one of them. She went to the Marquess. It was the boldest thing she had done since the North, and she stood a long moment outside the study door gathering the courage for it before she knocked her father's button turned over and over between her fingers in her pocket. When he called her in, she did it badly, her voice unsteady, catching him at the day's end, with the accounts open before him, and a single lamp lit, and the fire low. She said she had heard the child might be sent to Bath. She said she knew it was not her place to speak of it, that she was aware she overstepped, that he might dismiss her for it, and she would not complain. She said it anyway. She said the child had begun to heal, that she woke less often in the night now, that she had begun to eat without being watched, that only last week she had arranged her pebbles into a shape that was not a row, and had looked, for a moment, almost content. She said that sending her now to strangers to a schoolroom full of children who could all speak would undo every fragile thing that had been built. And she said that Sophronia had lost her mother and did not need also to lose the one house where someone stayed quiet with her. She had not meant to say the last part. It came out anyway, and with it something in her voice broke, just slightly, just enough, the small crack of a person who has held a thing too long. She stopped and pressed her lips together, and waited to be dismissed. The Marquess set down his pen. He did not speak at once. He looked at her across the desk for a long moment, at the gray gown and the worn cuff and the unsteady hands she had folded to keep still, and when he spoke, his voice was lower than she had ever heard it. "Who told you she would be sent to Bath?" "Your aunt. She said it was being considered. A good school, she said. Among her own kind." "My aunt," he repeated, and something cold moved behind his eyes. Nodded Eleanor, and his jaw set like carved stone. "It is not being considered. It will not be considered. The child will not be sent to Bath. Not to Bath. Not anywhere. She stays in this house where her mother is, where she is beginning, as you say, to heal." He paused and looked at her, and the coldness went out of his face and left something else, something unguarded that he did not trouble to guard. "As do you," he said. And then, because the moment had grown too large for both of them, too full of a thing neither was ready to name across a desk in lamplight, He said the thing he knew how to say, the only kind of tenderness he had left. "Sit down. You are pale, and you have not eaten. I can see it. Sit down. I will ring for something." It was a command. Eleanor heard the command, and she sat, because one did not refuse a Marquess, and she took the small supper that was brought and ate it under his level, watchful eye. And only later, alone in the nursery with the child asleep, did she lie awake and hear what had been underneath the command, and refuse, still out of long habit, to let herself believe it. That was the state of things on the night of the ball. The Dowager had won every visible battle, and did not know she was losing the war. Miss Croft was installed in white and gold at the center of the room. The county had come. And Eleanor, who was to have stayed above stairs entirely, had come down for 1/2 hour because a sleeping child asked her to, and stood now at the pale wall while a woman in violet said the nursery had been let loose, and the Marquess of Ravensmere, at the head of his own ballroom, turned his head one slow degree and did not look away. The Dowager saw the turn of his head. She had been watching for it all evening, and now she moved to end the matter publicly, cleanly, in front of the whole county, so that it could never be raised again. She crossed to Eleanor with Miss Croft in her wake, and her voice pitched to Carrie. "You have mistaken the invitation," she said. "The upper floors are yours, not this room. You are the governess, and a governess does not stand at a ball as though she were asked. Go up." A silence spread out from the words the way a ring spreads from a stone, dropped in water, faces turned. Miss Croft looked to the floor, with a small, satisfied mouth. Eleanor felt the whole weight of the room settle onto her gray gown, and she understood that whatever she did now would be seen by everyone, and remembered. And she did the only thing her father's daughter knew how to do. She inclined her head, and gathered her dignity like a mantle, and turned to go up. She did not reach the door. Across the length of the ballroom, at its glittering head, the Marquess of Ravensmere set down his glass. He did not hurry. He crossed the floor in the sight of every soul in the county, past Miss Croft in her white and gold, past the orchestra that faltered and found its place again, past his aunt whose fan had stopped in her hand, and the crowd parted before him because crowds always had, and he came to a halt in front of the governess in the gray gown who had turned to leave his house. The room did not breathe. He looked at Eleanor, and then he turned and looked at the whole of the county assembled, and he said, in a voice level and clear and meant to be heard in every corner, 7 words that could not be unsaid. "This lady will not be going upstairs." He offered her his hand. It hung there in the candlelight, a hand extended before 40 witnesses to a woman the room had just agreed was furniture. Eleanor looked at it. She looked at his face, which was not cold now, which had never truly been cold, only shut, and was open now in front of everyone, in a way that would cost him, and that he had plainly decided to pay. Her own hand was shaking. She was aware of the button in the small pocket at her waist, her father's button, the last of a man the world had also decided to unsee, and she thought of him, and she put her shaking hand into the Marquess's steady one, and his fingers closed around it, as though he had been waiting half a year to do exactly that. The Dowager found her voice. "Julian. Only that." His name fractured. He turned his head to her, and there was no cruelty in his face, only a great and final firmness. "You arranged a match under my roof that I did not ask for," he said quietly now. "For her and not for the room, though the room heard. You told a child she would be sent away. You told this lady she was not fit to stand in a room she has more right to than half the people in it. You did these things believing you served this family. You did not." He paused. "Miss Whitcomb will remain, as will my sister's daughter. And you will treat them both as you would treat the mistress of this house and her ward, because that, in time, is what I intend them to be." The fan slipped from the Dowager's fingers and struck the floor with a small sound that everyone heard. Miss Croft had gone quite white and quite still, and in her stillness there was, at the last, a flicker of something like recognition, the understanding of a young woman who has been told all her life she was the correct answer, and has just learned there was a different question. He did not humiliate his aunt further. He did not need to. He turned back to Eleanor. and the orchestra, uncertain, began again. And he led her not off the floor, but onto it, into the center of the room where the county could see. And he danced with the governess in the gray gown while the diamonds watched. And he bent his head and said, low, so that only she could hear, her name. Not Miss Whitcomb. Eleanor. She had not known he knew it. She looked up at him and found she could not speak, and did not need to, because her hand in his, and her heart going too fast, said everything her schooled voice had never been permitted to. They did not speak much as they danced. What was there to say that the crossing of the room had not already said? But near the end of it, when the turn of the dance brought them close, and the noise of the room fell behind them like a tide going out, he spoke again, and it was not a command this time, and it was not level. I stood in the passage, he said, and watched you hold her. And I understood that I had been a coward in my own house for half a year, and that you were braver in an afternoon than I had been since Cassandra died. His voice caught on his sister's name. I do not want the correct match. I have never wanted the correct anything. I want the woman who stayed quiet with a grieving child because it was the child who needed the quiet. He stopped. I want you. I have wanted you since the gallery. I did not think I had the right. And Eleanor, who had spent years being unseen and had built a whole life on the certainty that she would go on being unseen, felt the certainty come apart in her hands, and let it. The season did not end that night, but it changed its shape. The dowager left within the week, correctly and coldly, for a married daughter's house in the country, and if she never quite came to love Eleanor, she came, in the fullness of time, to write to her, which for the dowager was the same thing. Miss Crawt was married, by summer, to a viscount who adored her and suited her far better, and she sent, unexpectedly, a kind note. The county, which had decided in an evening that the governess was furniture, decided over a longer while, as counties do, that the new Marchioness of Ravensmere was a woman of quiet sense and unshowy dignity, and that the Marquess, who smiled now where he had not, had chosen better than anyone had expected, and better than he deserved, which was said fondly. And the yellow sitting room, Cassandra's room, was unlocked in the spring and aired, and Sophronia was allowed to keep her mother's things there, and to sit among them when she wished. The child spoke again in the new year. It happened without ceremony, on an ordinary morning. Snow at the window, and a fire in the nursery grate. Eleanor was reading, as she always did, whether the child listened or not, and she came to the end of a chapter, and paused. And into the pause, Sophronia said, in a small rusty voice that had not been used in 9 months, "Read the next one." Eleanor did not startle. She did not make it large. She turned the page, her hand not quite steady, and read the next one, and the child listened. And downstairs the Marquess, told of it an hour later, went up 2 stairs at a time and stopped in the nursery doorway, and simply looked at the 2 of them by the fire, and did not trust his voice, and did not need it. On the morning she was married, in the small chapel on the estate rather than the great church in town, because they had both had enough of being watched by counties, Eleanor took from her pocket the small button of mother-of-pearl that had come loose from her father's coat. The last of a good man the world had also decided to unsee, and she held it a moment in her gloved hand in the gray chapel light. She had carried it a long way. She had carried it through the north, and the cold, and the rented room where he died, through the closed doors of 3 great houses, and the mocking incuriosity of people who saw a gray gown and looked no further, through the pale wall at the edge of the glittering ballroom on the night she had been told to go upstairs. She had carried it as proof, on the days when she needed proof most, that she had once belonged to someone who had thought her worth staying for, that she had not always been the quiet one at the edge of the room. She did not need it as proof any longer. There was a man waiting for her at the chapel rail who had crossed a whole ballroom in front of a whole county to say she would not be going upstairs. And there was a child in the second pew, dark-eyed and talking now, who called her by a name that was not Miss Whitcomb. She did not need the button to know she was worth staying for. but she kept it, because a thing carried that far is not thrown away. She sewed it, that spring, to the inside of Sophronia's coat, at the cuff, on the seam where a small restless hand would find it and worry at it without knowing why, so that the child would carry forward the one true thing Eleanor's father had left her, which was not the button at all but the plain stubborn fact underneath it. The fact that some people, against all the evidence of a cold and hurrying world, stay. The snow came again the following winter, and Ravensmere House, which had been a monument, was a home. There was a fire in the yellow room now, most evenings, and music, because Eleanor had found she was permitted at last to sit at hearths she had once only passed. If you have stayed with me to the end of this, and you know what it is to be the quiet one at the edge of the room, then I hope you carry away the thing Eleanor carried, which is that being unseen is not the same as being unworthy, and that the right person crosses the whole length of the room. Sophronia, 9 years old and talking now more than she was silent, sat on the hearthrug in the firelight and arranged 3 small pebbles on the stone in a careful row, the way she had on the first night, and looked up and asked Eleanor to read the next one, and Eleanor did.